All right, everybody, can you hear me? Okay. My name is Cy Miller with J.E. Fuller. By practice and by trade, I'm a flood control engineer, hydrologist. So when the water goes in the ground, I've always called that a loss in my calculations and analyses. But ever since 2012, we've been working with Laurel for Cochise County, with others. The Nature Conservancy is a big player in our projects as well, but we've developed Cochise County's Aquifer Recharge Project program along the San Pedro. I want to talk about that, but I wanted to go over a little bit from an engineering perspective, some of the practicalities of planning for recharge projects first. So let's talk about example recharge projects. What might they look like? You might have ideas in your head of what they can look like. This is an example of an injection well where you actually have highly treated water here that's supplied to a well that's pumped down into the aquifer. This is intimate contact with the aquifer, inside the aquifer. This is pumped down into the aquifer and then recovered at a later phase. This is usually permitted as an underground storage facility. You can also have a vadose zone. So this brown zone in here is what we were talking about earlier, the vadose zone above the water table. This would be like a dry well system. Dry wells are pretty common in Arizona, and I think that we used a few in our project that we built, and I think they do a pretty good job as long as they're maintained and they continue to function the way they're anticipated and designed to do. There's also surface spreading, such as this. This is kind of a cross-section of a channel or a wash, if you will, with the water, and then the water is allowed to sink into the ground, infiltrate into the ground, and get into the water table that way. So the cross-section views, this is just plan view. This would be your dry well configuration. Similarly, with the surface spreading, recharge basin gets the water into the ground just by rapid infiltration, or any kind of infiltration, really. And then also, this is kind of an augmented infiltration gallery or infiltration facility, recharge facility. These are typically called T&L levees, where you can cause the water to make this long flow path and increase the wetted time, increase the length of the water, and increase the time that the water's in contact with the ground, so that you could promote infiltration and recharge. So that's basically kind of the basic concepts. And if you have more concepts of how to get water in the ground, I'm all ears. Let's talk about it. But and if anybody has any questions or wants to add or has any questions, feel free to interrupt me at any time. I should say for Cochise County, and some of this is repeat for, I know Randy, you were in the audience at the AFMA meeting, so anyway, some of you have seen this before, some of these slides before, but Cochise County's efforts have solely been to recharge the aquifer associated with the Sierra Vista subwatershed of the upper San Pedro River, and that's it. They're not talking about recovery at any point. They just want to prolong the wetted stream flow in the San Pedro, the base flow. So no intent to perform aquifer recharge and recovery. And we've done 3 projects so far. One, Palominas, I'll talk about these a little bit in more detail. Another one called Riverstone Ranch, and then another one called Bella Vista, which is ongoing and currently in the design phase, actually now. Here is a map of our projects. This was the Sierra Vista subwatershed we saw earlier. Laurel showed this outline before also in her groundwater modeling slides. But here we see the mountain front, the Huachuca Mountains down here, Sierra Vista's in here. And we started with Palominas first as our first project. Then we moved on to Riverstone here. And then we moved up to Bella Vista, moving north. Interestingly enough, we had greater predictions of water, available water, because of the urbanized area in Sierra Vista as we moved north, but our permeabilities at the surface and near the surface went way down as we went north. So we had more water to play with, but we were really constricted at getting water into the ground. Great permeabilities at Palominas, but not that much water, and more water at Bella Vista, but more difficulty getting it into the ground. So, yeah. Yes. Yeah, the EOP is that green spot right there. Yeah, EOP, Environmental Operations Park. They have some wetlands and birding platforms you can go and watch the birds, enjoy the wetlands. It's kind of odd that people want to go hang out at the wastewater treatment plant, but I don't know, birds, I guess. We started with Palominas primarily, both from the modeling that Laurel was doing, and also the Nature Conservancy conducts wet-dry mapping of the San Pedro Reach through here. So what they have a team of volunteers every, I think it's third week in July, right before the monsoon. Is it June? Okay. Right before the monsoon, they go out and walk the entire reach with GPS receivers and note where water's flowing and where water stops flowing. So they compile all that data, and then year on year, year after year on the x-axis here, that's going forward in time, they produce this map of wet versus dry at that same time period of the year. So Palominas was selected down here due to this persistently dry reach. We all thought, well, let's try to shoot for that and promote base flow in that area, because we know that it's persistently dry. So, I mean, interestingly enough, the EOP is there, and there's been relatively regular surface flow downstream of it. So, anecdotally, I guess the modeling matches what we see in the field. Laurel, what was it that you wanted to say about this slide?
Sorry, take this guy. This is some simulation results that help drive the process of design, but this is the parcel of land that the Nature Conservancy acquired in a fire sale, basically. When the economy crashed, they were able to pick up this large parcel that was slated for subdivision. The school is right here, and it was having a lot of flooding issues. So they bought this parcel with the idea of preventing any future pumping. That's one main objective, but also with the idea that it might be a good place for recharge to target this kind of endangered section of river, which, by the way, is in a gap between the federal parts of Sprinka, which this top part ends here, and the bottom part, there's a little patch down here by Mexico. But in between, it's all private land. And this is where we see the greatest threats to the continuous flow of San Pedro. So I simulated the change in head around a recharge point focused in the sort of eastern part of this parcel, and wanted to find out how that would affect base flow in this stretch of river. These are the simulated heads in 2030, so about 0.3 meters, about 1 foot of change out here, and I believe we started simulating recharge in 2012, I think. And then that is those are the cells where base flow showed some response. By 2030, the green is less flow than the blue. The blue is the highest amount of flow. And there's a gauging station right here, maintained by the USGS. But this was promising. So even within 15 to 18 years, we could see measurable response in the river. And we kind of expected that, because actually on this big square right here, there were 3 big center pivots, maybe 4 at one point. And people told us, anecdotally, oh, well, every time these wells turn on, we could see the river dry up. So we knew there was a likely strong connection in the subsurface between these areas. And then, by 2050, you can see that 0.3 meter line moved out a little farther. Heads built up a little more here. The bluer colors, the colored lines are 2050 contours. So the mound is strengthening and it's propagating out. And remember that northwest trending axis of this basin, and I said the Kona Depression is, I may not have said it, but I meant to say the Kona Depression parallels the river in a northwest-southeast trend, parallel to the river, and that's why the Baba Kamari is so threatened. But you can see this following that sort of following that trend toward the north-northwest a little bit. But the main news is that by 2050, the impacts to the river are a little bit less than they were in 2030. And this is a lesson in how to keep up with the expected pumping damage that's going to occur. So here's a case where, you know, you start out thinking you're having good results, but if you keep going, you find out that the pumping threat is kind of overwhelming your project after a while. So that's why thinking about things in the future and maybe stepwise approaches to projects can be helpful.
Thanks. And Laurel, do you remember what annual recharge rate you were? 500 acre feet a year. So that's yeah. So we came along. Let's see. I don't want to get ahead of myself here, but so we came along with Cochise County under contract to design a recharge and flood control project. Here I called it Palominas Recharge and Flood Control Project. Sometimes I also call it Palominas Flood Control and Recharge Project, depending on the nature of the audience that I was presenting to or talking with about it, depending on who's got what interests. But when we came on board, we got an aerial flight survey so that we could do our design. Existing conditions on the ground before we started any real work on analysis or design. Palominas School there. This is basically a half a section right here. And then with the exception of the school, the property was the remainder of that half section. The school had built a flood wall around it. They built a school right in the wash, and it's been there forever, and it got flooded, or there was concern for flooding from Palominas School, so they built a flood wall around it. Then there was concern with the neighbors that they were pushing water everywhere, and so there were flood control needs in this area when we started. And the county had built, right before we started our design, the county had built and constructed a box culvert underneath the road, and then they built and constructed this flood control channel leading out towards the San Pedro. So our wash comes in from the west, flows out, and then at the end of that flood control channel basically dissipates to surface sheet flow conditions. There are old ag fields east of there, and there's really no wash to speak of past to the east. But it's about a quarter mile to the San Pedro. So we had that close to the river proximity, and we were hoping for good soils to get water into the ground. So we started to do some testing. We had a subconsultant, Geosystems Analysis. Here's their logo. They produced this map. We started with the first cut. Initial testing that we did, field testing, was with backhoe test pits. They're limited in depth to about 12 feet. And along with those test pits, we also did cylinder infiltrometer testing at or near the ground surface. So the test pits allowed us to go down and see the surface stratification. Stratification, is it stratification, Laurel? I get my soil terms mixed up sometimes. But see the surface and we assigned 3 classifications of soil at the ground surface and below, based on general classifications of permeability. So looking for uniform permeability and assigning 3 classifications. We'll see the results of that in a little bit here. Then that backhoe test pit and cylinder infiltrometer testing informed our decisions for borehole drilling. So these are boreholes that we drilled almost to water level. I think we actually did poke the groundwater. You have to file a notification with an ADWR in order to actually drill into the groundwater. So we went pretty close to the groundwater with our boreholes, and that also allowed for some field classification of the soils in those borehole samples, and then also some laboratory testing for hydraulic conductivity with that. And then that allowed us to produce a map like this. This is a profile view showing our test pits and our boreholes with Unit 1, Unit 2, and Unit 3 classifications of soil. So these are units, excuse me, my allergies are terrible. These are units with uniform infiltration characteristics, uniform percent fines, that kind of thing, as you go through the boreholes. So this is actually in that flood control channel that was east of the project, east of the road. When we got into analysis and design, Karen Riggs, the county engineer at the time in Cochise County, to her credit, we were looking at that Mansker parcel, but she also said, well, we just built that flood control channel over there. Why don't we look over there? So sure enough, we actually found the greatest infiltration characteristics in that flood control channel downstream. So it was kind of a learning process, you know, as we were doing the design. Thanks a lot. As we were doing the design, it was also a bit of a learning process and trying to kind of take data as we get it and inform our next decisions on that. So you can kind of see here, we've got pretty good. Unit 1 is the highest permeability soil, the target soil that we're looking to design our recharge capability for the facility. So you can see in the channel, we've got a little bit of clay, a little bit of Unit 3, low permeability, but then as we get down in through here, we start to see some pretty good soil that we thought, okay, we can get water into the ground. So I went back and did my my SCS curve number methodology HEC1 model for 7.5 square mile watershed. The schoolhouse wash is what the wash is called. So 7.5 square miles, about 8% impervious cover, grassland, 3-hour storm, type 2 distribution, and the SCS curve number methodology, which is common down there in Cochise County for determining rainfall runoff characteristics. And the site overview is, I'm going to have a sip of water, but often referred to as a Mansker tract, is roughly that half square mile section. Excuse me for a second. All right, sorry about that. With the box culvert crossing Palominas Road and the flood control channel downstream. So that was our site boundary, if you will. So I laid this project out. I drew all the lines and did the construction plans for it. And I have it here kind of overlaid on the eastern portion of that property. When we got into it, we didn't know where we were going to build the project within the property, and as our field testing data came in, we decided closer to the river is better for a recharge, given the long time period that you'd have to anticipate for recharged water to actually affect the aquifer, the shallow subsurface aquifer underneath the river. So we targeted the eastern portion, also where we had the highest permeability soil. So this facility was laid out with a detention basin, so to serve the flood control needs of the area. We excavated this detention basin out, so we needed someplace to put the soil cut. So we created a stockpile over here. And then in the in-channel basins, and I'll go over each of these two areas here in a minute. But in that downstream channel, we constructed cells, infiltration cells there. So I'll talk about the detention basin portion first. This was mostly excavation. There is a bit of an embankment, a berm along here. The primary outlet, it's kind of tough to see, but the primary outlet is essentially a great inlet catch basin box. So this is 3 feet here, and that white line is actually one of our monitoring stations that I'll talk about in a little bit. So it's essentially a great inlet. That black line is a great catch basin inlet. And then I had 3 6-inch weep holes here to allow minor flows out of the basin and stay within our allowable ponding time that we had for the project. And then also a concrete overflow weir. So there's the box culvert leading out to the downstream flood control channel. The concrete overflow weir is to handle large flows. And I should have pointed it out in an earlier slide. I had my routing table from the hydrograph routing for our design storms. In the 100-year storm, essentially the 100-year comes in and goes out. There's no attenuation really from the facility. It's more of a minor flood control facility, but it fit within the budgetary limits, and there was also a need, I think, for some of these people were being affected by, on this side of the road, I believe that some of them were being affected by sheet flow that we intercepted with the construction of the facility. So downstream, this is really the recharge portion of our project, where we constructed these 13 cells, if you will. They're roughly 3 feet deep. They are separated by transverse concrete weir walls. It's kind of hard to see on a white background, but we built concrete transverse weir walls with notches in there. And then within each of the cells, we put in some augmentation features. So we put in a few gravel infiltration trenches. So this is roughly a 6 foot deep trapezoidal channel that we backfilled with clean washed gravel and then put a riprap cap over the top. And this is just to reduce evaporation, get water into the ground as fast as possible, and promote the infiltration. And we also put dry wells in our channel. I was really hesitant to do this, getting into, being that I was the design engineer. This was suggested, and I didn't like the idea, but we did it. This was a pilot project, and so I think we learned that the dry wells actually do, they do a pretty good job. As long as you can keep the water going into them clean and keep them maintained, I think that they would do a pretty good job. And also, we've been talking about some other designs for something similar to a dry well that's not exactly this Maxwell copyright dry well. Something if you could get a creative driller and a contractor to build something for you that would resemble this, but maybe not be quite as onerous or quite as complicated. We've been talking about those. So this is a nice picture of the concept here. I didn't do this drawing, but an artist for the Nature Conservancy did. This is kind of our mountain front recharge area. The San Pedro is flowing out of the screen here, up in the screen, and you can see our project there, very close to the river. And essentially, the red line here is the groundwater level that's predicted to occur based on the pumping that's been going on, and the blue line here is the pre-development, if you will, groundwater level. So the idea is similar to the EOP: create a mound, create a barrier, so that this water will, more likely go into the aquifer and support the river. Yes.
Just curious, when you're doing channel basins,
Mm-hmm.
you took your existing channel and then dug basins within it? Is that
Right. Yeah, so we came in the channel before construction, before our project, was roughly 100 feet wide, 4 to 1 sides, trapezoidal channel, 4 feet deep or something like that. And then we went down another 3 feet with that, and then built roughly at the bed of the channel pre-project is where the crests of those weir walls are.
You didn't interrupt the volume and capacity of that existing channel, you just dug them.
Right. Yeah, we didn't want to mess up the flood control carrying capabilities of that constructed county facility. And we added freeboard to each side of the channel. It's not a levee, but they needed some place to put the cut, with what was coming out of the channel. So we added freeboard to the channel, both left and right. So I think it's got more capacity than it did before we came on board. Any other questions? Yeah.
With the difference between the trapezoidal catches and dry wells, what's the difference? What is each one that you did?
So I am going to say that we did 2 types of dry wells. We did single cell dry wells, just the concrete standard dry well. Then we did the dual cell dry wells like you would see in a parking lot, where the catchment cell is in the channel and then the actual dry well is out on the bank. Those are expensive, and I think that they're prone to failure. I mean, that over time they're going to decrease in their effectiveness, I believe. And the trapezoidal infiltration trenches, I think, in my mind anyway, my opinion, is that they are not as expensive. And if one plugs up, you can just build another one. You don't need to do your ADEQ dry well permit program notification or application. I think that they're more simple to construct, and if one fails, you can just build another one right next to it because you know that you have the good soils there. So in my mind, in my opinion, the the infiltration trenches are better. Yeah.
Those work well because the proximity to groundwater though, right? If you had, or the water table, if you had a really deep water table, that probably wouldn't work as well, or would it?
Correct. Yeah, we were roughly 50 feet to groundwater here. I want to say maybe even a little bit more. Yeah, I think that those, unless you really want to dig them deep, which you can, I think that they would be good in that situation. But if it was really, really deep, a dry well might be a better solution for you.
If I can interject a little bit, in this case, yeah, we knew that the groundwater system was not to be, we were aiming to get groundwater to the river, so that was the standard. But if you just want to get water in the ground, you know, because of the steady fine, you know, it would be depends on what your objective is. Correct. You just want a general catchment, maybe more takes longer to do.
Yeah.
And then in citing your dry wells,
Mhm.
you know, because of sediment and everything, were you putting those more towards the side, or were you putting them right in the middle?
I put them towards the side, and I also raised the inlet 0.25 feet or something like that off the actual bottom of the channel, so that there's some sedimentation that can happen in that bottom cell in the bottom of the floor of the channel, and when it gets to that level of being at the grate, then maintenance needs to occur with that. Randy, did you have a question?
Permeable soils go all the way down to the aquifer?
Let's see. We had a slide, I think that will answer that question, if I can back up. So that blue triangle is the water table. So in this, the most downstream basin, we had let's see, what is that? About a few feet of, let's say a few feet of clay on top that hopefully we excavated out and met that permeable soil layer that does go right to the water table. So there was also lots of talk about, you know, water can go down, and then it can go left. Like Laura was talking about before, it can go left and right and in every direction until it finds another avenue, you know, another seep or route for it to go downwards, because these are interbedded soils. Yes?
Sorry about that.
No, that's fine.
Just kind of a continued thought with this, and then kind of earlier, I forget the name of the zone there before you can get down and the water starts getting in there.
Vados.
Vados.
Mm-hmm.
I guess that's almost the key. What is the depth of that zone, and
Yeah.
how do you get past that in order to make, you know, because I think
Yeah.
I said you could then put the water exactly where you want.
The,
You get close to the water table.
I believe the dry wells have to end predicted 10 feet above the water table. And so if you've got hundreds of feet to go, I mean, obviously that dry well is going to be more expensive than if you had 50 feet to go. But you could put the water closer to the water table.
in general,
Yeah, absolutely. Any other questions? I'm going to zoom back through my slides here. After construction, we've got an ect. We've got a hanging ect. It's supposed to say Palamedes Recharge Project, but After construction, we worked with the contractor and Geosystems put in a whole bunch of monitoring equipment, lots of pressure transducers, because we wanted to know what's the depth in our basin, what's the depth in the 13 recharge basins, what are the depths, how do the heads fall in the dry wells, and we wanted to know all kinds of information, so we instrumented the heck out of this thing. We had monitoring wells. This up here, since the surface and groundwater gradient is towards the river, this is a monitoring well that we put in and we call our baseline well, so to represent conditions that would be happening without the project in place. There's another well here, middle of the project, and then there's a well down at the end. And that well was actually constructed quite some time ago and was there before the flood control channel was built by the county. And it's why the flood control channel actually ends there, because somebody drew plans and didn't realize that there was a well there, and they had to stop the flood control channel a little short. But anyway, it provided a good, we instrumented that even before we did construction. And while we were in design, we said, why don't we just put a pressure transducer on that and collect some data, baseline data, before we do anything. So it allowed us to get a little bit of a handle on what was going on there before we built our project. That was about the only data that we had as far as baseline flow, groundwater conditions. We got into this without much information in terms of what is our annual runoff volume in the wash, or what do we expect to see, on a regular basis. Okay, yeah, they're here. There's the dry wells. There are two there, there are two there, and there are two there. Yeah, they're like about midway, both midway.
I mean, one thing that happens with these detention basins is that you can have fines in the early ones. So my supposition was that it would be best to have, dry wells or other maintenance things on the downstream to avoid.
Yeah, the detention basin itself, I think, does a good job of settling out some of those fines. That was part of the intent with having this be the recharge component, is let's try to clean that water up as much as possible, settle it out, meter it out through those weep holes or that grate inlet, and then there is nothing in that first basin. So I want to say that first basin we even considered maybe sacrificial, that we would just let it go and let it fill up with sediment and fine material during the life of the project. Oh, sorry. Oh yeah, there is. There's a lot of maintenance. A little bit more on well, there's less maintenance than we thought because we got less flow than we thought, but I'll touch on that in a little bit. Sorry, I forgot to mention we had pressure transducers. We also had instrumented boreholes, which are basically, we drilled a well and then we backfilled it with permeable material and a sensor to measure soil moisture, and then put a clay cap and then a little bit more permeable material and a moisture sensor and a clay cap. So it's a progressive chambers, vertical column of chambers that measure soil moisture at certain depths. So knowing where those are, we can measure what's going on with the soil moisture in those areas. And the pressure transducers, I think that's the extent, the monitoring wells, that's about the extent of the monitoring program, I want to say. So in the end, the project site construction spanned about 3 months, right before monsoons. We had Hurricane Odile come through right after the construction was finished, which was a little harrowing for me to watch the radar go, send the hurricane. Instead of going through Tucson, it took a big right turn and went right over Palominas, and I thought there were going to be problems, but there weren't. Not too bad. The disturbance footprint is 35 acres. We moved about 100,000 cubic yards of excavation at a cost of $1.4 million, give or take. That's construction. That's just construction. Analysis and design was in addition to that. And since 2014, when we finished, The first year of our monitoring period, these monitoring periods are a little bit irregular because we went from a July to July period to a calendar year period, but generally speaking, these are roughly about a year. Our first year, we had 40.6 acre feet of recharge that we estimated based on our monitoring equipment and everything that we collected. And from then on, 15.3, 2015 to 16, 8.4, 16 to 17, and in 17, 5.3 acre feet of recharge. A little bit different from Laurel's turning on the faucet of 500 acre feet a year scenario. Yeah. So with the pressure transducers, we can determine how much water comes in and then do a volume calculation on that. And then based on some account for loss, ET, that goes into the ground, essentially, accounting for some ET loss. So we didn't put much vegetation out there on purpose. We did a hydroseed after, but we didn't want to have phreatophytes, mesquites or anything anywhere, anywhere. Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, we've gotten some minor grass and stuff popping up, but we've been lucky to not have too many mesquites or any other thirsty trees. Well, that's the thing. Yeah, I said that there was maintenance. We were expecting a lot more maintenance, and in that sense, we were lucky to not have to do so much maintenance, but we perhaps got a little bit ahead of ourselves in terms of planning for 500 acre or making any assertion that we were going to do 500 acre feet a year because we didn't have any baseline data on regular flows. Yeah, so we had my HEC one was design storm based. We had another model that was done to predict annual runoff volumes. And that first cut of the model was 350 acre feet a year we were expected from 7.5 square miles. If you do the math back of the napkin, it checks out. It makes sense, say 12 inches a year rainfall or something. It's within the ballpark of what we would expect as flood control engineers. After the first year of monitoring data and we ran some actual precipitation data through my model and this model that was used to calculate annual runoff volumes, we ratcheted down that number to 159 acre feet a year, but still we're well above what we're actually seeing. And we're working towards calibration, but when you have flood control and other modeling parameters that are assigned by the book, you can go down to normal or dry conditions or sparse vegetation or whatever you want, but you still have to stick to those bottom level numbers that you shall use, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I will say even too, these years, although we say it's been dry for a number of years, these years were pretty average as far as total rainfall. I think that intensity has a lot to do with it. If you get a 3-hour storm that dumps a few tenths of an inch and it's very gentle and there's not that S curve that we all we all like to look at. I think that intensity really drives runoff.
Real key is cumulative soil moisture. So if you
Yeah.
have a change in piece of regime from summer to winter, start having much light rains like that, even though they may be, coming in as succession, you never really saturate soil though, and
Yeah. The watershed here is it has some dispersed areas. My routing reaches in HEC 1, if you're familiar, were very competent channels, 8-point cross section or something. But there are areas in this watershed where there's a wash, and as it goes down, it just hits a grass field, and there's no wash for a few hundred or 1,000 or more feet, and then the wash picks up again, and then it just fans out again. So. We have done some more. I'll get to this. I think the next slide has. After we did the Palominas project and reported these low numbers, we started to think that we should put in some gauges. We did very, very simple pressure transducer sensors in the wash bottoms, where the other locations where we were planning our recharge projects. Just to try to get our arms around how much water are we really seeing on an annual basis. And even this one is on Coyote Wash, which is just downstream of Sierra Vista, the city of Sierra Vista. That's a very tributary, urbanized watershed. I mean, they've got concrete channels that lead to bigger concrete channels and other channels, flood control channels that it's not that dispersed condition that Palominas had, but even in these cases, we're seeing much, much less runoff than we predict with our HEC 1 or other models. This is more data than we had when we started Palominas. So it's helping to inform, and I think it might push, some discussion a little bit about how you analyze for these things. These projects, because it's more on an annual basis, the time step of the groundwater model maybe, than it is your 3-hour storm or 6-hour storm or 24-hour storm, anything like that. But I think that brings it to the end of my portion. Were there any questions? Yeah?
If you're finding that trend, then what would be the disadvantage to doing more injection wells, where you're getting it right to the water?
With
Water quality,
treated effluent or runoff?
but going that route instead of if the ground's sucking it up that fast. Understand?
Yeah. It's food for thought. I mean, yeah. Yeah.
If it doesn't go through the ground, is it actually less purified?
Well, there's a dry well and injection well. I mean, the injection well is actually in intimate contact with the aquifer. That has to be variable treated. Yeah. All right. Joe?
All right, so that leads us into what we've been doing in Kingman. So over the last couple of years, we've been working through with the city of Kingman and Mohave County, from the flood control aspect, putting together a Flow 2D model for basically all of Kingman. Everything that drains, basically the entire city of Kingman and the offsite watersheds that flow down through it. And so through that process, we did a Flow 2D model. That's a 20-foot grid. And during the first phase of the project, it was the Kingman flood risk study. We were able to look at different areas that had flooding problems and come up with some possible solutions for what those flooding problems would be. That led into refining the model on the east side of Kingman for the current East Kingman Risk Map project that you all have seen and been involved in mapping new floodplains on that side of town, like Rattlesnake Wash, Rancho Santa Fe Parkway, that sort of area in there, down to the school that's in the middle of the flood zone, like we all like to see. Or we don't like to see, but they just end up there. So along with that, what we began to do last fall was began to look into the question of is there some potential for some flood control recharge basins in the Rattlesnake Wash watershed. So if you look, this is I-40 here. This is Route 66, Andy Devine here. We were focusing on this watershed right here. This is the main stem of Rattlesnake Wash, comes down through here, crosses the railroad down to the Mohave Channel that flows north out of town. The way we started to do this was to look at, okay, well, what land is available, and what could we possibly put in there, in those pieces of land that could provide some flood control benefit. And by the way, let's see what kind of volumes we could get that could possibly use for recharge, right? So we ran our, let me go back. We ran our Flow 2D model, and what we manipulated the model to essentially show these basins in place that didn't have outlets. So the water would flow in, it would build up to a certain point, and then it would begin to flow back out. So that water would be left behind and not included in the modeling flowing down the stream from that. What we tried to do with these basins were tried to stay away from jurisdictional dam classification. So we either graded them in with with two different ways. So jurisdictional dam, you need to stay under 25 feet of height and less than 50 acre feet of water, or you can stay under 6 feet of height with your berm and have as much volume as you want, or you stay under 15 acre feet and you can have a high berm. So what we tried to do was to stay in this box of being exempt from that in this planning, so we had legit options. So this is kind of how we began to look at it. We just like I said, we tried to we graded in some berms and then excavated to a certain depth, 10 feet, 15 feet, something like that, to gain the amount of volume we wanted to see stored so that it could actually have an impact on the 10 and the 100-year events. Then also in some of the other basins, just the way the topography was, they lended themselves to, you could almost build a dam essentially and make it high, but you wouldn't be able to store that much water because of how it would tie into the hills. So we ended up with like a 25-foot high berm and a volume, total volume of less than 50 acre feet. And so this isn't, we didn't get super specific on, tying down the grading perfectly, but it was at least good enough to add into our Flow 2D model to see what would happen. So what we ended up with in East Kingman is 3 basins. These are these big utility easements that come across here. There's the power, there's the gas. There's that storage tank on the hill right there. Basically, we had these 3 basins in the BLM land coming right out of the hills. That flows down, across I-40. This is that gravel pit. And we had several different basin combinations down here that we were looking at for possibilities. So with these, we modeled the 10 and the 100-year events based on the Flow 2D modeling, and we came up with this number based on the grading. If all these basins filled in a storm, you'd be left with 410 acre-feet plus or minus left in the holes, right? So you have to have a storm big enough to fill those up. So the 10-year storm, the 100-year storm would fill all these, they'd flow out. It had some pretty good attenuation characteristics for reducing the 100-year flow. For the 10-year event, it was looking like we ended up with about 170 acre-feet of storage in these basins, and we didn't model the 2-year event. Now this is where, in looking back at this and some of the stuff we're talking about here, that number we need to be careful with about how much water is actually going to end up in these basins. So if we look at just kind of looking at the lay of the land, for these basins, these are tucked up right at the foot of this hill, and then it gets real flat, flows out through these basins and down past the school. So you're really in right in that foothills. You might be, who knows how the infiltration characteristics are there, or down here in Basin E. We didn't get into any of that. So, big picture, it seems as though from the flood control aspect, there's some good opportunities on this side of town for, if you have the availability to develop some basins, you can really provide some serious attenuation for the 100-year event that influences the floodplain mapping and the flooding in the school, which has happened, and things like that. So there's some real opportunities there. The recharge aspects, that's to be debated, I suppose. So this next round of modeling that we've done, that we're in the process of right now, I just finished running the most recent round of models here. This is West Kingman. So this is I-40 is down here, Stockton Hill is coming up here. This is Riata Valley, Crestwood, and this is this main wash that comes out of the BLM land up here. So what we looked at doing here was grading in several different basins. One here above Riata, and 2 basins kind of stepped in this canyon above Crestwood. This is state land up here. These are areas that we looked at with the flood risk study for Kingman. And we had looked at some different basin combinations, but we stayed away from the state land. We looked at more of the private land within the city limits. With this, we backed up and said, okay, because what we found was that it was really hard to get enough volume to do much attenuation with these basins on the private land with the footprints that you could have. With the state land, we kind of stretched our arms a little bit and made a basin as big as we needed it to be to provide enough attenuation that it could provide a benefit. So what we found is that again up here on the BLM land, this is a little bit hard to access, but there's some opportunities for some decent sized basins up there. We found again that flood control wise, it can be a real benefit. I mean, you can almost retain the whole 10-year event if you're looking at that to design to, and you can have a really big impact on the 100-year. Some of these, like the 100-year event from here, went from 3,000 down to 1,000. In the Riata, it was nearly 1,000, and it's down to about 150 CFS. So there's opportunity if you have enough volume to provide some good flood control. What we found though is that so the total volume, if all these fill, is about 92 acre feet. The 10-year volume based on the modeling is about 50 acre-feet. And I think the telling part of the story is when we modeled the 2-year, you can't even see the basins. There's like no water in the basins. And so that, that's just based on the infiltration parameters and the losses that we have in the model, but it's where you really start to see the 2-year event. Grid depths is coming out of the urbanized areas where you do have all the impervious areas. The 2-year is going to generate some flow, but from this upper watershed, it's just not. And so you have a lot of more minor rainfall events, and these basins will most likely be dry. So, what this got another. Yeah, so what this is looking like, kind of in profile, you can kind of see you're coming right out of the mountains. These are tucked right on the right on the urban interface of the mountains. And then it has a long stretch down to the Mohave Channel that flows north out of town. So it is right up in the foothills there. So this leads to the question, and I was kind of thinking through this and wrapping up my stuff for the West Kingman project. Is, well, what's the point? What's the real goal with this? If you want to look at the stuff we've done from the flood control aspect, there's some definite benefits you can have to the flood control. If you're looking at it from the recharge aspect, this whole process has really opened my eyes to maybe some alternative ways we need to think about it, and managing expectations and understanding, well, how much runoff is the watershed actually going to produce? And then, that gets into the question of, in the best case scenario, will the recharge make a difference? And what is the difference that you're trying to make? Helping to really define that. And then also, the way we had begun to look at this was basically retention basins. If you would possibly look at this from the detention basin standpoint, you could probably have a more effective tool to attenuate flows if you're not storing all the water on site, right? If you're routing it through the basin with an outlet structure. So which track do you want to go down? You want to go down recharge? Do you want to go down flood control? Do you want to keep them combined? What's the best way to approach that? And it's a big question. And then, depending on what that difference is and what's the goal, are there better locations than what we've been looking at to do recharge, right? So it's an interesting question.
Side note on your retention and detention point, I don't know that it's an issue in this basin, but in many parts of the world, there's a key legal reason to use one word or the other, and that's water rights. I mean, in San Pedro, they're pretty much scared to death to talk about impeding natural flows. So it's always about, let's just slow the flow, and we'll let the peaks go by, and there's always this threat of somebody, yeah. And I don't know if the Colorado River poses that same kind of framework on you. I mean, as a hydrologist, I would say, yeah, you could be held accountable for whatever natural inputs to that system exist. And if you disrupt that, if I were a water rights holder, I would say, yeah, that's stopping it, but that's the kind of deep and mysterious part of water law that doesn't really account for the connection between groundwater and surface water, so, but it's starting to be addressed more and more, so it's just one of those things to kind of think about in the long term. You know, is there any reason why you need to consider that? Yeah, and even then, now more and more people are starting to look at, you know, what's the relationship between that flood flow in the mountains versus the discharge to the basin. Are you changing it? Of course, you're changing it every time you pump water out of the ground. Yeah, so it's all a matter of scale and all that.
So that's the end of the presentation, and you know, if what kind of questions do you guys have? Do you have any other points you want to talk about with that, or questions about what we, you know, anything we've talked about so far?
I have a question for Laurel. In your presentation, you said that there's a natural outlet for the aquifer.
Yes.
And so I think you said Lake Mohave, or
Well, those are the yeah, but
so-
there is a natural outlet to the Wallapai Basin to the north, into Lake Mead. No, I don't. I mean, it's wherever the saturated zone is, but there was a natural outflow of over 5,000 acres per year. And, you know, that may have changed now because of pumping, but ostensibly it's somewhere in that ballpark. There's a subterranean nexus. I mean, even though it's not maybe coming out as a spring or something, there is discharge, unless the lake is so high that it's backing up the aquifer, but there is a connection, and it's head dependent.
This was this image says discharge to the Mead.
Talking about surface water,
Yeah,
nexus.
underground. Yes, this is underground. Yeah. But theoretically, you could change that amount of discharge from the basin with a pumping plant. Correct. But you would be fighting that battle. It'd be a complicated battle because the law is ambiguous. Oh, absolutely. I mean, and the law has never addressed that. And the water rights is always, especially in the east, it's pertinent to the land, So groundwater, you pump whatever you need on the land. But now hydrology's evolved enough, and the legal frameworks have sort of extended a bit, and now people are saying, wait a minute, we understand this. You're actually taking water out from under our state. You know? So this is a very interesting case that's pending, and could make a huge difference in the way water's regulated. There are tribes that have subsurface water rights, federally reserved water rights that are based on the fact that a groundwater aquifer discharges to a stream system. Pine Top is an example. Pine Top is on the rim. Whatnot Apache tribe that discharges into its rivers down below the rim, but there's pumping on the rim that impacts those flows, and so the tribe has a reserved right to that groundwater. And you see that was kind of a groundbreaking ruling.
So, I just wanted to address the recharge basin a little bit, and we talked a little bit offline, but just for the group. USGS is taking into consideration some of So I guess there's benefits to it, but that benefit's kind of hard to measure as far as how direct of an
It's not that hard, it may be hard to know the timing.
time.
Yeah, but it's very easy to say, here are the abstractions from ET, and we're avoiding that by accelerating and, reducing the surface presence of the water and accelerating the downward flow. And frankly, that's where the natural recharge mostly occurs, is right at the base of the mountains. And so there's probably a factor network there, and it's probably a good place to do recharge if your objective is to just get water in the ground as fast as possible. And the water tables tend to go up. Faster opportunity to get that flow towards the base. So there are some good reasons to do it there, depending on what your objective is.
So if the city and the county were to get together, they come to the rest.
It helps if everyone's on the same page going forward. Having some kind of,
And how, and actually not only what, but what time frame.
yeah, how much and when. That's the first thing. What are you trying to accomplish? And then,
Within the city of Kingman, have the water levels been dropping in your wells, or are they, like, what's kind of spurred this, if you don't mind me asking, spurred the conversation?
I think the farming market happened to be a amount of water that
And it was the levels that the farmers were presenting that they would be using as far as, I mean, you look at the last USGS study that showed a water budget of, how much the city uses, kind of where all those demands were. And those were just eclipsed by what the farmers were suggesting that they would use.
a 5 to 10 times.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So looking at that, it brought a lot of concern. If we're using this much and we strike this the last 300 or so many years, they're coming in at 10 times that, we need to start moving.
Yeah, and so what you're gonna be facing there is 2 cones of depression and a groundwater divide. And so that should shape your conversations a lot about where future pumping goes, where future recharge goes, the synergy between those cones, or the antagonistic relationship between them. Because then you don't wanna get into a race to the bottom paradigm, but that could be what's going on.
which is kind of what's going on.
Well, it's going on in Arizona too. These unregulated basins are seen as cash crops for investors and venture capitalists. Yeah, right, so it's good to be armed with some knowledge ahead of time about what is it worth to protect those investments, Maybe the city doesn't feel like it's worth buying that land now, but if they see what the value of it could be if they don't, what the cost could be, then suddenly it becomes maybe more reasonable. Something like that, I'm just saying, like, Clarkdale didn't think there was much value in maybe investing in purple pipes until they realized the benefits of protecting the municipal system. So, yeah, just understanding where you fit and how things work is really important. And that's fast. I actually have a project in my head that I want to do, but I've noticed just in my years of work that a typical municipal well in this state, they tend to go down about a foot per year. Sierra Vista is that way, Tucson's that way. So when I see something on the order of 2 feet per year or more, I start going, wow, that's a big deal. I think there's something about the way wells are constructed versus the way the demand works in general hydraulic properties. Something about that balances out to about 1 foot a for you is that the trees have to draw on your system. Yeah, yeah, those can be tough to.
Certainly our city council is interested in recharge at this point.
So what do you think of, as we move forward as a community together, getting the kind of maybe looking at ways
Of course, there's four of us.
Yeah.
There's four of us.
Yeah, there are more. And that's what we're trying to do is like, have us have real estate.
I don't think overslow recharge is what this is. I think they got that.
Well, let me just add that water budgets are very simple and people really like them for that reason. And from a water budget perspective, that recharge project will solve a lot of problems. It will cancel out some of the, depletions that it causes. The question is, what difference does that make in a spatial and temporal sense? And so that's the part that, we fought an uphill battle with King County and King Central for a long, long time. It was only about getting to that depletion number smaller and smaller, but it didn't have any regard for the spatial and temporal distribution of it. So it's natural for people to pay a lot of attention to those numbers. It's real easy to see what goes in, what goes out, what the difference is. Very much more difficult for people to get a grip on how long it takes and what the relationship between water over here and water over here. Yeah, reality is just a whole lot more complicated. But, I can see a city councilman saying, oh yeah, that solves that 3,000 acre foot problem, so we're good. We've been there, we've done that thing.
I guess with we've got the injection well in process. It'd be good to actually examine how long this is going to take.
Yeah. And by the way, Sedona has a true injection well system. Where they're going down into the Redwall limestone, which is a cavernous limestone system, and they're putting water directly in that system. And this is a whole new experiment. We haven't had anything like this. I mean, this is 700-foot injection. Yeah. And it's super unknown what's going to happen. I mean, I've done some simulations on it, but kind of like the scuba diving through the cave picture. We have no idea where water goes once it hits that limestone. It's full of fractures and dissolution pockets. And, we don't know if it's actually going to make it to the Verde or if it's going to come out in Oak Creek or if it's going to go. We just have no idea. And so it'll be really interesting to follow that.
Right.
Well, they've done some tracer studies in the testing process. They use caffeine and aspartame. Yeah. seems a good picture, and I don't think they were able to pick those up in their monitoring. Which is a whole other conversation we can have sometime about wastewater and forensics and, yeah. it's super interesting.